Hello, I am Carl Plosel. I'm an environmental engineer with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and I'm the project coordinator for the Toalta landfill case. And this is the public input session, which summarizes potential terms for a preliminary injunction order in the federal case, United States versus the municipality of Toalta. This gives you an overall view of the landfill from 2020. Where you can see up front the access road, the operations center and such, and then the waste placement in the back. And you can also see some of the close by residents. Another angle view, which gives you a better look at the southern section of the landfill and how close it is to local housing. This is an overhead view of the landfill where we've delineated some stuff that will come up later in the presentation, including the likely extent of the waste placement, since it's not always obvious because of the green growth that occurs and the lack of formal design for this landfill. We've also illustrated two subregions of the landfill. The odd format of this photo is because the center square off section is from more recent drone photography, the summer of 2020, and the surrounding photography is from 2016. In February 2021, Department of Justice filed on behalf of the EPA a complaint in federal court against the municipality of Toalta, claiming that the conditions at the landfill constitute an imminent substantial endangerment. In July, DOJ filed a request that federal court issue an order requiring Toalta to immediately address the endangerments at the landfill. Now, the interim steps that have occurred, the parties, that's EPA, DOJ, and municipality of Toalta, have been discussing a potential agreement called a stipulated preliminary injunction order, or preliminary injunction to be issued by the court. There is no final agreed upon order, and the purpose of this public session is to hear from the public to inform us better at what the conditions of the final order should actually be. Interim steps. We're looking for public input on the following potential order terms and going through them. Stopping of the waste disposal. At what point should the waste disposal stop? Making clear that the landfill is closed. That's sort of posting of signs and a formal declaration. The requiring daily cover, an essential operation of normal landfill function. Intermediate cover, which is the first formal step toward closing the landfill and would provide a substantial protective soil cover in anticipation of a formal landfill cap. Maintaining the cover, both daily and intermediate cover. Controlling of the leachate, that's the contaminated liquid that leaches through the waste and mostly goes into the aquifer below the landfill, but occasionally can be seen breaking out at the sides or contaminating stormwater, which leads you to the next, which is controlling stormwater, where contaminants from landfill can be carried off into the local neighborhood. Another interim step is addressing the north slope, which is substantially steep. Addressing the southeast cell, which was the only portion of the landfill to ever have a liner in a leachate collection system, which is no longer functioning. The reporting requirements, the access requirements for agencies and people inspecting to make sure that the municipality is complying with the requirements, community involvement, such as this meeting, and reservations, the things that are not covered in the preliminary injunction. Now, going through each of the terms of the potential order in a little more detail, stopping waste disposal. That is to occur in this potential order immediately, with significant exception of an area called the North Slope. Making clear the landfill is closed, the installation of signs at the entrances, and there are several entrances, stating in both Spanish and English that landfill is closed, and that any continuing operations at the landfill will be consistent with the order terms. Requiring daily cover. As I discussed, that's a normal part of landfill operations, and it'd be 6 inches of soil or the equivalent over any newly disposed waste or uncovered waste if you're doing cut and fill operations by the end of each operating day, except when severe weather conditions make the application of daily cover unsafe. Intermediate cover. They're to apply under the potential order, they're to apply intermediate cover, which is at least 1 foot of soil. That's on top of the daily cover at the rate of 1 acre per month during the first year and 2 acres per month during the second year until the entire landfill has been closed. Intermediate cover is also a necessary base for any final cap system. And a final cap is essentially the only way of ensuring that the continuing leachate contamination of the lower aquifer is slowed or halted. An exception was allowed in the potential order for any area that already has soil cover and vegetation that provides as much protection as a layer of intermediate cover. There are some areas of landfill that likely this would be a consideration. Another term is maintaining the cover. Monitoring for soil erosion at least every 2 weeks and after main rainfall events, and the requirement to repair those eroded soils. Here's a picture to illustrate unmaintained cover soil. You can see the exposed waste, the mud, and the avenue for stormwater releases of contaminated stormwater. Now, another important part of the potential order is controlling leachate. It requires plans to install controls to reduce and collect the leachate, the liquid that seeps out the bottom of the landfill, and to reduce the leachate releases by 90% within 2 years, exempting the area in the southeast cell, which we discuss it later in this. Convey the collected leachate through the AAA or the process system, or handle the leachate in an on-site wastewater treatment system. So they need to treat the leachate or ensure that it gets properly treated. Monitor the landfill surface to find any leachate seeps. That's essentially a surface breakout of leachate, relatively minor portion of the leachate contamination, and to make the appropriate fixes to ensure that no leachate escapes to off-site property. So the seeps here can contaminate stormwater that runs off the site. It should be very clear that upwards of 99% of the leachate is not seen and percolates directly into the underlying aquifer. Here's a little illustration. I didn't put seeps here because it is such a small proportion of the leachate, but the main problem with the landfill is the leachate that's contaminating the underlying aquifer, which is ultimately the North Coast Aquifer. Here's an example of a seep, a breakout of leachate on the side of the landfill. And it should be pretty clear how this might contaminate stormwater that runs off the site. While this looks like a substantial amount of leachate, again, it's only a small percentage of the leachate that's released from the landfill. It's just the visible portion. Controlling stormwater, another important part of any potential order and of the terms of the one that we're outlining here. Within 30 days, the the landfill must implement measures to control mosquitoes, reduce standing water, and limit erosion. Those are the normal operations that should be in any construction site in any landfill. Then prepare and implement a stormwater control plan that'll cover the facility for more of a long-term control of stormwater releases. It also would include regular environmental sampling of stormwater discharges for landfill pollutants, and if they're detected, to implement controls or improve controls to prevent such contamination. And it includes a requirement to manage the water in the north and south ponds, which are heavily contaminated with leachate. Another element of this is addressing the north slope, a fairly large percentage of the landfill. Part of the north slope is sloped at an angle steeper than 2.5 to 1, which means 2.5 feet horizontal to every 1 foot vertical. And that is generally considered the break point between a stable slope and an unstable slope. The general rule of thumb for landfill slopes is to keep it at 3 to 1, a relatively shallow slope. So among others, inspectors can walk the slopes and it's relatively stable. All of Puerto Rico is in a seismic zone, which makes slope stability a bigger issue. And this landfill is in karst, itself an unstable area, subject to void collapses and such. So slope stability is a bigger issue here than it would be in a lot of landfills in the United States. Now, in addressing the north slope, that's where this presentation gets detailed. Corrective measures are, and these aren't really in any dispute, you have to limit the instability by reducing the amount of stormwater that seeps into the north slope, and they need to do it relatively quickly. And anyone who's seen mudslides knows that in storm events, steep slopes can become significantly less stable. But some of the things they need to do relatively quickly would be diversion controls, such as berms, benches, and silt fences, to divert the stormwater runoff from the stormwater that hits the top deck, the rainwater hits the top deck, and direct it away from the north slope area. And the resulting need for controls to convey that stormwater off the slopes and down to the landfill base. Some of the other measures certainly make the north slope less steep or otherwise more stable. That needs to be done long-term for proper closure of the landfill. A lot of options were considered, some of which we've illustrated here. Continuing of placement of new waste to achieve proper slopes, along with the necessary berms and such. And this is estimated by TOALTA to last 18 to 24 months. Another option is placement of new waste to achieve proper slopes after DNER approval of a final closure plan. And that would be no more waste until it's an approved closure plan. And then also there's relocation and regrading of existing waste to achieve proper slopes. And obviously there's a possibility of other options or combinations of these. Okay, so we're illustrating a couple of the available options here. Certainly not all of the available ways to deal with the north slope. We welcome public comments on other options that you might wish us to more seriously consider. The first one, option 1, is continued placement of new waste to achieve proper slopes. That has to be done with a berm. The berm is built and then the waste is placed to shallow out the angle of the slope and slopes now down to the top of the berm. and then that would be a 3-to-1 slope. The final waste placement would ultimately be supervised by Department of Natural and Environmental Resources, DNER. Now, with these options, you need to limit the amount of waste because otherwise the landfill just continues operating. And one of the ways is limiting the quantity and duration of such waste placement. That's option 1A. Or limiting the area in which additional waste placement could occur. And I've included a map here, which is option 1B. There's, of course, possibility of doing both. Now, some more details with option 1. That's the continued placement of new waste. Considerations include there will be some continued environmental impacts, increased pollutants to the aquifer. We should say, though, those are typical of a landfill without a bottom liner, an open dump, so to speak, which were prohibited by federal statute after 1994 or 1996, depending on how you read the statute. EPA believes that such impacts will be relatively minor, provided Toa Alta fully complies with cover placement, leachate controls, and stormwater control requirements. This option could reduce the cost to correct the steepness of the north slope compared to using some other engineering controls. It delays the Toa Alta off-site disposal costs, something of much interest to the municipality. There are difficulties normally in monitoring compliance with volumetric limits. The area limits are more easy to monitor. Now, option 2, placement of new waste to achieve proper slopes after Department of Natural and Environmental Resource approval final closure plan. This is the stop putting waste in until you have a final plan. In compliance with the daily cover requirements, leachate controls and stormwater controls during the placement of new waste on the north slope would be subject to Commonwealth monitoring rather than EPA. Waste placement in the north would be integrated into the final closure plan. It postpones addressing the steepness risk. And you'll have an initial, the 18 to 24 months or so, off-site disposal costs, and quite likely resuming disposal at the north slope upon approval of the closure plan and continuing until stabilization project is completed. And may involve additional litigation between DNER and Toa Alta, which could further delay the process. Now, another option, I'll call option 3, is the regrading of existing waste to achieve proper north slopes. Again, this would need to be with a berm. No placement of new waste on the north slope. Relocation and regrading of existing landfill wastes to achieve the final slopes. It's been said that it might present an increased risk of physical danger to landfill workers performing regrading, though that's not necessarily in comparison to the placement of new waste, which certainly presents a risk of physical danger to landfill workers also. May increase odors from the temporary re-exposure of buried decomposing wastes. Technically, we're not talking about increasing the odors so much as the type of odors. Long decomposing waste will tend to be anaerobic and will have what is often perceived as a stinkier smell than fresh waste, though I don't think you would want to characterize it as more odor, but more of a potentially objectionable odor. That, of course, can be compensated for by proper application of daily cover. And it's said to be more costly than the preceding options, but that's because the waste, they would cease putting waste at the landfill and begin the off-site disposal costs immediately. Now, some photos to try to explain some of this. The insert photo is the view of the north slope, and in the background photo, the yellow arrow illustrates the angle that that view is. In this case, the red line shows the likely extent of the waste, and you can see the North Pond is contaminated with waste. And you can also see that the landfill extends well past where you can visibly see the landfill from the photo. The blue line illustrates the steeper portion of the landfill, which we call the north slope, plus a 10-meter buffer area for most of it. So technically, it's not all the steep slopes, but it contains the steepest slopes. And then, which we'll discuss a little later, the southeast cell, the portion that once had a liner and a leachate collection system, is also illustrated on this. But you can see the north slope is a substantial portion of the landfill. Now, the southeast cell. The southeast cell of the landfill was constructed like in 2006 and 2007 with a bottom liner and a leachate collection, interception, collection, and pumping system designed to remove the leachate generated within that portion of the landfill. The leachate system is not operating, has not operated since 2014. We are working on a solution for the southeast cell leachate system. This proposed order does not include any of the plans for the southeast cell or any of the work that would need to be done. Any fixes that are feasible would need to be addressed in the future in some other format after the federal court approves the stipulated preliminary injunction order. Other terms in the potential order include reporting, which would be detailed monthly reports during the life of the potential order, the EPA, DOJ, and DNER reporting compliance with the terms of it, access so that they could be inspected on a regular basis to confirm or identify confirm compliance or identify non-compliance with the preliminary injunction. Community involvement. Obviously, this is the first major step in that. But we make copies of the plans and reports available to the community so that additional comments could be made and the community could be informed of the work done and any issues with the work done that have come to the attention of EPA. Now, this preliminary injunction does not include all of the necessary work to be done at this landfill, and it has certain other cutouts or reservations from it. Landfill expansion. This preliminary order would not prohibit ToAlta from applying for permission from the Commonwealth and other government agencies to build additional areas for disposal of waste at the landfill. Obviously, we feel strongly that if any expansion is done, it should be fully protected. It does not necessarily prohibit additional waste placement. ToAlta could place more waste at the landfill if it was included in a final closure plan approved by DNER. For example, for proper grading. It is beyond the scope of this potential order. And of course, EPA and Department of Justice would reserve the right to assert in the current lawsuit or a separate action that any conditions at the landfill present an imminent substantial endangerment. So the agencies are reserving the right to come back to this issue. Future measures at the landfill. The purpose of the federal case and the proposed stipulated potential preliminary injunction order to address imminent substantial endangerments, some of the imminent substantial endangerments that EPA believes exist at the landfill. DNER will take responsibility, the Commonwealth take responsibility to ensure that ToAlta properly addresses the north slope and permanently closes the landfill. And by permanently closing, we mean a cap on the landfill to greatly limit the amount of leachate that's released to the aquifer, as well as a landfill gas collection and control system that would significantly reduce airborne contamination, landfill gas from that is currently being released by the landfill. And obviously, I won't be getting questions in this forum. And we are accepting public comments until February, March 4th. And I'd personally like to encourage members of the public, including qualified environmental professionals, to submit your comments either directly to the federal staff that'll be at the public meeting, by email address, a lengthy one is listed here, by standard mail to my colleague Eduardo Gonzalez in our Caribbean division. We must note that we must receive your comments in person, online, or in an envelope postmarked by Friday, March 4th, 2022. We need some deadline to this. And please include the title, Toa Alta Landfill Comments, in the subject line of your communication. Your name and a statement of whether you're a resident of Toa Alta. Again, though, we encourage comments from not only the residents of Toa Alta, but the regulated community and interested parties throughout Puerto Rico. And thank you very much for your time.